So I would like to introduce everybody to Dr. Chloe Schmidt. She's a assistant professor in biology here at Dalhousie University. So Chloe will be giving a talk essentially focusing in on her work with evolutionary ecology. So Chloe's interested in the evolution of biology using population genetics tools. She works at regional to global scales to understand how evolutionary processes across multiple species respond to the environment. She also explores how human-caused environmental changes reshape patterns of biodiversity and ways to mitigate genetic diversity loss to protect the future adaptive potential of wildlife populations. So Schmidt, like I said, is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology here, but is also holding a current research chair for emerging scholars. She leads the Biodiversity and Population Genetics Lab, has a BA from Rutgers University in New Jersey in the States, master's from the Université de Lausanne in Switzerland, PhD from the University of Manitoba, and in 2024 was awarded the American Society of Naturalists Early Career Investigator Award, as well as, excuse this, the Dobzhansky Prize winner, awarded by the Society for the Study of Evolution to recognize the accomplishments and future promise of an early career evolutionary biologist. Chloe also enjoys arts and illustrations as part of hobbies in free time. So join me in thanking Dr. Chloe Schmidt for coming to give this talk. Thanks a lot. Okay, can someone please confirm in the chat if we are being heard? I guess maybe mute on your end if you can.
Hi, Tanner, it's Alana. We can hear you just fine, but we cannot hear Chloe.
Okay, we're getting feedback on our end, so excuse us for one more moment. We're muted, but we hear it, so.
Your computer. Can you hear me from here?
Yes. Very faintly.
Very faintly.
Oh, no, that's better.
All right. Not fully resolved because I can't change the slides. It's only this computer over here. Oh.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, we came back. Okay, so I will stand close to the computer here, but there's another sound output.
Is it this laptop? Yes, it is. So it would be coming from yours. Maybe disconnect the HDMI. Yeah. Is it in here? Hello? Yeah, going.
Hello, hello? No.
Yeah, so believe it or not, it's our first time in this room. Speaker. Oh, there it is. How about now? And then on this, now, still, of course.
What if
Maybe now? No. Okay, so seemingly everything's muted and every speaker setting is still giving us audio. So again, sorry for this delay. Maybe on this end. Yeah, speaker came back. Mute will go HDMI and then maybe. Yeah, there it is, I think. If it doesn't change it now. On speaker here, but that sounds promising. That sounds good. We've done it. Okay, so
Okay.
for that delay, I think we're finally good to start.
All right. So I hope online can still hear me, but I'll start again. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad all of you could make it out tonight, despite the extremely frigid weather we were having today. And today I'm going to talk about the unintentional ways that humans are affecting the evolution of wildlife populations. Now, humans have been kind of mucking around with evolution for thousands of years. A lot of this time has been on purpose. And this example is very clear with the many varieties of domesticated species that we have today. So up here, I've got a quick example of some pigeons, because pigeon breeding was a hobby of Charles Darwin, who's of course, the person who brought us evolution by natural selection. And in this case, we kind of go from our regular everyday looking pigeon to selecting for specific traits such as curly wings or a tail that kind of looks like a turkey, through a process of selective breeding and artificial selection. So humans are kind of choosing specific traits they are interested in increasing the frequency of in a population. And so we specifically choose to breed certain individuals to achieve this.
Sorry.
Share again.
No. So of course it's shared on her laptop. I cannot see that.
Please. Okay. Let's go from here. Share. Share. Share.
It's a good thing we're scientists.
Okay. Okay. Third time's the charm. I hope. At least the sound didn't start coming back. Okay, so we have our example of pigeons. Let's see if I can hide these controls again. Maybe not. All right, as long as they hang out up there, it's fine. So we started with pigeons. We also have very clear examples of humans selecting for specific traits in the evolution and domestication of dogs, where we have hundreds of breeds of all different shapes, sizes, and colors. Again, humans are specifically choosing the traits they are interested in perpetuating in populations, as these dog breeds are slowly and eventually diverging away from wolves. And if we look at an example from the vegetable world, we have this Brassica oleracea plant, which in the wild is a wild cabbage plant. And humans have selectively, again, over thousands of years, bred for specific traits. So to either enlarge the leaves or enlarge the stems, or selecting for more lateral buds on this plant to end up with a very wide variety of different vegetable types that we might encounter every day at the grocery store. And so these are very clear examples of where humans are affecting evolution on purpose. They're really using evolution for their own ends to create different breeds of animals that we enjoy having around as companions or we think are nice to look at, or breeding for specific types of vegetables with different traits that we think taste good. So those are examples where humans are applying a very kind of direct and strong selection pressure to achieve the goals that they are trying to achieve. But we also have a lot of effects on evolution that are unintentional, okay? And examples of this include the evolution of tusklessness in elephants. In this case, in a lot of African elephant populations in the wild right now, they're under poaching pressure from individuals who are killing elephants to harvest their tusks for ivory. And in these cases, by selectively removing individuals with large tusks from a population, we're kind of enabling individuals that don't have tusks to be the main survivors and the individuals that are going to continue to reproduce in that population. So over time, we see this tuskless phenotype start to increase in frequency in the population. From the perspective of the poachers, this is, of course, the opposite effect of what you would want to see if you are specifically looking to harvest very large elephant tusks. But this is nevertheless a predictable outcome of that process of removing individuals with tusks from a wild population. We also see very widespread unintended evolutionary effects when we apply antiviral or antibiotic drugs to viral and bacterial pathogens. This schematic is of an example of the evolution of resistance to the AZT drug in HIV. In this case, again, by applying an antiviral drug to a population of viroids, we are killing off all of the individual virus particles that are susceptible to the antiviral drug, which again puts a very strong selection pressure on those virus particles that are resistant to be the only ones that are there to survive and multiply. So in both of these cases, these consequences of the evolutionary pressures that we apply to these populations are unintended. We do not want antibiotic or antiviral resistance to evolve in these populations, but they are still very predictable. You know, if you are, again, removing individuals with large tusks from a population, it makes sense that tusklessness is eventually going to evolve. If we are continuing to apply drugs to pathogens, we can predict that they will evolve resistance because this is a very strong and direct selection pressure. We also see these kinds of consequences happening in a lot of other examples. We can think about trophy hunting, where again, if you imagine hunting bighorn sheep, for example, you're going to be targeting those bigger individuals that have bigger horns, and again, selectively removing them from the population, which doesn't allow them to continue to breed. And similar things can happen in fisheries evolution as well. If you're going in with a kind of big net and trawling as many fish as you can, it's going to be those smaller fish that are able to escape through the holes in the net. And again, those are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce in next generations. So over time, your populations of fish are going to get smaller. Oftentimes, this is really, again, not the outcome we are looking for, but it is, again, predictable. However, at the current time, humans are having really broad-scale, widespread effects on the environment and on ecosystems that we don't yet really fully understand all of the implications that these environmental changes can be having on the ecology and evolution of organisms. So global change kind of in totality is causing populations to evolve, but because it's not this very specific directional selection pressure we're applying to populations, we don't really yet understand all the different ways they might respond to this. So the kind of the big three major environmental impacts that humans have on environments that are driving current biodiversity declines are overharvest, habitat loss and transformation, as well as climate change, which involves both the kind of increasing temperatures we're seeing on average year to year, as well as the increased frequency of extreme weather events. Okay? And so with these three kind of major habitat changes that are occurring across the globe, we do still make some very general predictions about how this is going to affect wildlife populations. So we generally expect that in response to these types of environmental perturbations, we're going to see populations start to decline. So that means individuals are going to die, abundance is going to go down. We also expect to see species ranges, so that's their geographic distributions where they occur. We expect to see these shift kind of up and down as species are tracking their preferred environments or preferred temperatures, or potentially expand or contract. And in general, all of this together also generally leads us to believe that a lot of species are going to be at higher risk of extinction. Now, the form, or I guess one facet of global change that I'm going to focus on mostly tonight is that of urbanization. And that's because at present, more than half of the global population lives in cities. In Canada, this number is around or above 70% of the population. This global urban population is projected to double by 2050. And compared to 2000, the global urban land area is projected to triple by the year 2030. So this is adding another 1.2 square kilometers to that global land area that's covered by urban areas. And so this is cities are one of the newest and most rapidly expanding habitat types on the planet right now. And so it's important for us to kind of come to grips with how these are affecting wildlife populations, and particularly thinking about this from the human side of things, because with most of the world's population living in cities, this is also becoming where a majority of the population is interacting with wildlife. And so if we think about what's happening to a wildlife population as we move along a rural to urban gradient, we can think that in this kind of less disturbed, kind of more natural, for lack of a better word, habitat, we're going to see populations that are generally relatively large and well connected, okay? So in this natural habitat, there's not too many kind of physical barriers that are separating populations and kind of keeping them genetically distinct. But as we move across this urbanization gradient, what we're seeing is kind of relatively less and less natural habitat available for these individuals to use, but we're also seeing increasing habitat fragmentation. So as we go from this kind of very well-connected forest habitat into the natural habitats we see in cities, those might comprise of mostly parks that are kind of small compared to the rural habitat and sparsely scattered around the city. And so what we predict to see in regards to populations is that they're generally going to become smaller and more geographically or spatially isolated from each other. And these two things together, so reduced population size and reduced population connectivity, both are predicted to lead to decreases in genetic diversity. Okay, so why am I talking about genetic diversity? Why do we care about genetic diversity? Genetic diversity is kind of everything for evolution, right? It is the fuel of evolution. We absolutely need genetic diversity in order for evolution to occur. From the conservation side of things, there's kind of three main pillars of biodiversity that have been deemed relevant for conservation. Those are species biodiversity, ecosystem biodiversity, and the third one is genetic diversity. If we come back to thinking about our pigeon example, we can't have any of these trait changes across generations in pigeons if there is no genetic variation underlying these traits, okay? So we can't go from an individual that has flat wings like this to one that has curly wings like that unless there is some genetic variation underlying the kind of shape of the feather in this species. And you can imagine here, there's really nothing for natural selection to actually select if there's no variation, right? So if you only have genes for flat wings, you can pick this one, you're going to get flat wings. You can pick another one, you're going to get flat wings. You have to have some genetic variation in there for selection and evolution to actually proceed. Now, decreasing genetic diversity is a conservation concern. So like I said, this is one of the three main pillars of biodiversity that is important for conservation. We are well aware of the negative effects of having very low genetic diversity. A clear example of this is in bulldogs, which in purebred individuals, they have very low genetic diversity due to multiple generations of inbreeding. We know now that bulldogs are associated with a lot of congenital and other types of diseases. They also have a relatively low median lifespan for their size. And all of this is because of their low genetic diversity due to inbreeding across many generations. In an example, in a wild population, the cheetah is a very well-known endangered species that is like completely genetically depauperate. At this point, there is so little genetic diversity. I think you can even, kind of do skin grafts between individuals and there's no rejection because the skin cells can't tell the difference between different individuals. If a disease were to enter this population, it could potentially wipe out the entire thing because they are so genetically similar. Cheetahs also in general have very low reproductive success. So that means they are not very capable of producing lots of offspring that are able to survive to adulthood. Okay, so having very low genetic diversity and particularly having decreasing genetic diversity over time is a very bad thing for a species, which is why we are actively trying to conserve genetic diversity in wild populations. There are four main evolutionary forces that shape the genetic diversity of populations. So in any population, genetic diversity is always due to four things. Those are natural selection, genetic mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. Genetic drift, I'll get into a little bit more in a second, but the thing to keep in mind here is that over time, this erodes genetic diversity in a population. So if genetic drift is very strong, that means genetic diversity is going to decrease. Gene flow is just the kind of exchange of different genetic variants across different populations. This tends to increase genetic diversity because we're kind of injecting new genetic variants into a population that comes from a genetically different population. I'm going to go on a very quick, I hope, tangent about genetic drift because it's my absolute favorite evolutionary force. I think a lot of the time we think about evolution as this kind of like linear progression from, simple to more complex, or from, one trait to a trait that is optimally fit to its environment. But evolution really doesn't work that way. And I think genetic drift in particular embodies that really well, because genetic drift is just complete randomness. Okay, so genetic drift really is just pure sampling error in the evolutionary process. I'll illustrate this example using a bag of 1,000 marbles. So let's imagine that we have a bag of 1,000 marbles. 500 of those marbles are blue, 500 are yellow. If we take a very small sample of marbles out of this bag, so let's say we're going to stick our hand in and yank out 10 marbles, we might find that 8 of those marbles are blue and 2 of those marbles are yellow. That is quite different from this initial 50-50 ratio that we had in our bag to start with. If, on the other hand, we stick our hand in and we pull out 600 marbles instead, here we're pulling out 51% blue marbles and 49% yellow marbles. This is very close to our initial 50-50 ratio that we had in the bag. If we repeat this exercise hundreds of times, what we're going to see over time is that every time we take a very large sample of marbles out of this bag, we're going to more closely reproduce this original 50-50 ratio. So we're going to get, 51, 49, 50-50 some of the time, but they're all going to stay pretty close and pretty stable to the original frequencies in the bag. Every time we're taking a very small sample, on the other hand, we're going to see these percentages really jump around all over the place. So sometimes we might sample 80-20, sometimes 50-50, sometimes 70-30, sometimes 90-10. So all this to say is that when you take small samples from a larger pool of objects, you're going to have a lot more randomness in the frequencies of those different things you're pulling out over time. And this is basically exactly what happens in genetic drift. if you have a small population, you are essentially taking very few marbles out of the bag that is a gigantic gene pool of all the possible gametes that you can make in a population. These very random fluctuations of genetic variance in populations, depending on the size of the population, has ramifications for the process of evolution and adaptation. In a very big population, so imagine we're taking a big sample out of that bag, what we're going to see is that allele frequencies will remain relatively stable year on year, right? Or generation on generation, because we're not having so much randomness with our small samples, right? And so that means that natural selection can proceed rather efficiently, right? So we can have adaptation happen efficiently over time. And that's because selection can work on if there's an allele that's good for a population, it can slowly increase its frequency. If there's one that's bad, it can get rid of it. This is the opposite when we look at evolution happening in small populations. Here, when we have small populations, our allele frequencies are really just bouncing around very randomly over time. And that's what happens when genetic drift is the major driver of allele frequency change in populations. And in this case, natural selection might want to pick a genetic variant that is good for a population and spread it, but it can't because, oh no, it's gone just because of drift. So genetic drift can cause genetic variants to change in their frequencies really regardless of whether or not they are good for a population. And in total, this means that in a small population, they are less efficient at adapting. So they're really not as good as dealing with environmental changes as a bigger population would be. So when we come back to thinking about evolution across an urbanization gradient, what this reduced genetic diversity would mean in these smaller, more isolated populations of mice in our city over there is that we would then expect adaptation to new and changing environments in these populations to be more difficult for those mice. Our major question here is, although this is kind of our prediction of what's going to happen along urbanization gradients, we don't actually know if that is the case for all species in all places. And so our first step here was to ask, like, how general is this process kind of in real populations? And we addressed this question, and we addressed multiple kinds of questions like this in our lab using a data synthesis approach. This essentially means we're working with data that is already publicly available. We harvest kind of all of the genetic data that we can find that is archived in online repositories, and we're basically recycling it and repurposing it to ask new kinds of questions at very broad spatial and taxonomic scales. So we want to know the answers to very generalizable questions across multiple different kinds of species. On the map, each point here represents one location where multiple individuals were sampled to obtain genetic data. And I just want to give a shout out to everyone who has been helping to compile this database over the years because it's been a real labor of love. We've been doing it for almost 10 years now. We're still not done. This map is slightly out of date, but it's not too far progressed from what you see now. So currently we're at over a little over 3,000 different locations sampled with 262 species and over 150,000 individual genotype data. Okay, and so in this first kind of studies I'm going to show you the results from, we looked specifically at how genetic diversity is related to the intensity of urbanization across mammals, birds, and amphibians across Canada and the United States. On this graph, the red dashed line will indicate no effect of urbanization. So any points on that line will suggest that genetic diversity isn't related to urbanization at all. Anything above that line is going to indicate that genetic diversity is increasing with the increasing intensity of urbanization. Oops. And anything below the line will suggest that genetic diversity is decreasing with increasing urbanization. Okay. And what we found for mammals was consistent with our predictions that in general, all of the species in our data set were consistently negatively affected by urbanization. So this line here in the middle indicates our kind of average overall effect across all of the species in our sample. And the circles behind here indicate our species-specific effects of urbanization. What we can see here is that all of the points in this overall effect are on the lower side of the graph, so we saw this consistent negative effect across all of our species. We didn't see this same effect for birds. In general, birds overall, we saw no effect of urbanization, but in the end, this tended to be due to the fact that some species had higher genetic diversity in cities, those are above the red line, and some species had lower genetic diversity in cities, like the mammals. Finally, when we looked at amphibians, we found just absolutely nothing. There was no effect on average across all the species, and there was no effect within individual species either. What we actually think is going on here is not that urbanization doesn't affect amphibians, but kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum, amphibians are so sensitive to environmental changes that it seems more likely that city populations were probably getting completely wiped out before they were able to be sampled to really quantify and monitor changes in genetic diversity. And so if we kind of look at these results all together as a whole, we can make another level of generalization, looking at how this effect of dispersal ability or the capacity of individuals to just move around really well moderates this effect of urbanization on genetic diversity. So amphibians, like I said, super sensitive to environments, also pretty small, not really great at moving around if you've ever watched like a salamander kind of wheel along on the ground. We wouldn't expect them to do very well in cities because they really wouldn't be able to maintain a very well-connected population in a city. Mammals are doing a little bit better. They're larger. They can move around different habitats very well, but they're still bound to the ground. And so they're going to be more affected by physical barriers like roads and buildings, railroad tracks, all those different kinds of features of a city. Birds, on the other hand, because they're able to fly, might be the taxa that's best able to maintain these large, well-connected populations in cities because they might be the least affected by these barriers. And this is a question that an honor student in my lab is currently working on, asking whether better movement ability in birds contributes to this effect of seeing some species actually having higher genetic diversity in cities. And his preliminary results do suggest that this is the case, which is extremely exciting. So if we move into kind of the second half of the talk here, we've mostly been focusing on effects of urbanization across an entire rural to urban gradient. Okay, and we've also been kind of considering cities as basically monoliths. We know that this process of urbanization tends to be similar wherever it occurs. You know, it's going to involve more paved surfaces, roads, parking lots, and things, more buildings and impervious surfaces in general. But the fact remains that different cities are different, and you also find a large variety of habitats within a city, right? If we look at this kind of slightly old picture of Halifax here, we can see there's a lot of different habitat types available around different parts of the city. We have this downtown area over here, which is very highly built up. So a lot of buildings, parking lots, streets. We've got the Citadel area up here, which is a green space, but this green space is mostly kind of lawn with not a lot of trees. And on the other end, we have a more residential area that will have more street trees, kind of older street trees that provide canopy cover, as well as urban parks. Okay. And so across a city, that means that natural resources that are beneficial for wildlife are going to be differently available in different parts of urban areas. And in cities, because cities are, you know, at their core habitats that are defined and designed by humans, the distribution of these resources in a city are going to be determined by human factors. These can be cultural, social, economic factors, and they can also play out at different levels. So from individual households to local municipal levels, state or provincial levels, the federal level, etc. And I'll focus here on one particular example of this from the United States, focusing on this policy of redlining that was practiced between the 1930s and the 1960s across the United States. And this was essentially a policy that really generated and perpetuated a lot of racial residential segregation in cities across the US. What happened during this process is that different parts of cities, so different neighborhoods within cities, were ranked and given one of these 4 grades, depending on their racial composition and housing stock. So the grades ranked from A, which indicated the kind of best and most desirable neighborhoods to live in, down to D, which were the most hazardous, least desirable neighborhoods within cities that were also determined to be the areas that would be the most risky investments for mortgages. So the effects that this had on the demographics of cities and the kind of racial mosaic of cities was that racial and ethnic minorities and predominantly Black Americans were systematically excluded from purchasing homes in areas that received higher ranked grades. Over time, due to differential investments in different neighborhoods within cities, we also tend to see a correlation between the amount of natural resources available and habitat quality that starkly differs across areas with different grades. Oftentimes, these barriers defined by these redlining maps, and those are actually all available on the public archives online in case anyone's interested in reading more about them. But these redlining neighborhoods were often maintained by physical barriers. If we're thinking about this from the population level, these are obviously also going to be barriers to wildlife moving around cities, right? So for example, sometimes this was actual physical walls. Other times it took the form of building roads and highways, again, through predominantly minority communities. And these environmental effects of redlining persist today. So like I said, due to kind of differential investment and greening pathways following redlining, it often happened that predominantly minority areas would have lower canopy cover. They would have younger trees that don't provide as much canopy cover. And they would also more likely be closer located to different types of environmental disamenities like factories, very heavily urbanized and built up areas, and sometimes even toxic waste dumps. And so we know that even presently, after redlining was outlawed in 1964 with the passing of the Federal Housing Act, areas that were graded D in the past still currently have 21% less tree cover than higher graded neighborhoods. They are about 2.5 degrees warmer than higher ranked neighborhoods, and they in general have less green space. And so altogether, really thinking about this from the wildlife perspective for the moment, this suggests that there's going to be less natural resources available for wildlife populations to use in areas that received these lower grades, which still today tend to be predominantly racial and ethnic minorities. And so we wanted to explore this potential relationship between the racial composition of neighborhoods within cities and their effects on wildlife genetic diversity of terrestrial vertebrates. And we first, our first step was to focus our data set only on using sample locations that were located within city limits. And we then quantified a metric of residential segregation by quantifying the proportions of residents identifying as white in the US Census across a different size radius around each of these locations. And our first step here was to confirm whether we could recapture known patterns associated with redlining within our data. So we looked to see how our index of residential segregation here was related to kind of urban intensity, or the intensity of built up areas, using the human footprint index, which goes from 1 to 50 and measures this intensity of urbanization, and the human population density at each of these locations. We do see that we were able to capture known patterns, so that neighborhoods with higher proportions of white residents tended to be less built up and have lower human population densities. If we then look at the relationships between residential segregation and wildlife populations using a couple different genetic metrics here, I'll show you a similar plot to what we were looking at before, but with the actual data on it this time. Our genetic metrics on the y-axis here are first effective population size, which really directly tells us about that strength of genetic drift acting on populations. So bigger effective population size is better. That means natural selection is more efficient. Gene diversity and allelic richness are two alternative measures of genetic diversity. And we last looked at a metric of population differentiation, which tells us how genetically different or similar populations are, which is an indication of how well connected they are. What we tended to see first was that as the proportion of white residents in a neighborhood increased, we saw larger effective population sizes, we saw higher genetic diversity, and we also saw reduced population differentiation. And so these results across all the terrestrial vertebrate classes that we looked at aligned with our predictions that due to the historical kind of legacy effects of redlining on the composition of cities today, we still tend to see that areas with higher proportions of white residents seem to be supporting larger and more well-connected populations of wildlife, which seems very likely to be due to the higher or greater availability of natural resources and kind of like higher environment quality in terms of parks and green spaces. Something else that I want to point out here is that it seems quite interesting when we're looking at populations that were only sampled inside cities, we're seeing a different pattern from what we saw looking across the entire rural to urban gradient. So here you'll notice that all of the different taxonomic groups, or amphibians, mammals, birds, and reptiles, are all tending to trend in the same direction when we focus only on those populations that are actually living within cities. So it seems that wildlife populations of all types, with invertebrates at least, would tend to benefit from having more natural resources available in the city. So these results generally suggest that biodiversity does vary within cities, and this contributes to exacerbating human inequality within cities. We know that these patterns aren't only related to genetic data. We also see this with species richness and even the kind of amount of biodiversity data that's available to be able to look at these patterns. And it's also important thinking about this from the human side as well, because habitats that are not good for wildlife are also really not great for humans, right? So some of the aspects of cities that can be harmful for human health include this heat island effect. So this refers to the fact that cities tend to have higher temperatures than their more natural surroundings. This is made worse by having a lot of pavement and buildings around that are reflecting and absorbing a lot of heat. This is made worse by not having as much vegetation around to help provide shade and absorb some of that heat. And these higher temperatures are also associated with negative health outcomes that are related to different types of pollution, specifically air pollution, as it can kind of interact with different respiratory disorders like asthma, for example. So kind of what do we do about this? It seems like in general, if we are improving habitat for wildlife in cities to benefit wildlife in cities, this is potentially really good for humans as well. And I know we're kind of coming down in time, so I'll zoom through the rest of this a bit quickly. But so I wanted to show this example of another study we did looking at the relationships between protected areas and genetic diversity. So asking how well protected areas are covering populations that are genetically diverse. And I think these results kind of speak to what we were just talking about what's happening in cities. So in this study, we looked at the global protected area network across terrestrial and marine habitats, focusing on marine fish and terrestrial mammals. I'll focus here on our results from mammals, because interestingly, what we found was that mammal populations that are closer to more protected areas tended to be more genetically diverse. So I know this plot is a lot, but all we're looking at, each of these kilometer numbers on the y-axis just refers to how big a buffer size we were looking at across all of our sites. We can see that these effects are consistent across all of our different buffer sizes. So in general, it seems that regardless of whether a specific location is itself actually protected, it seems like just having more protected areas around in the vicinity has positive effects for genetic diversity in wildlife because it provides them that habitat and those resources that they're able to use. We also saw that this effect was stronger in larger species, and this makes sense because larger species have larger habitat requirements. They require a lot more space. And so particularly for large species, it can be hard to design protected areas that are of sufficient size to really be to have a strong effect on them. So again, this effect of just having more protected areas around, kind of regardless of their size, can be beneficial for maintaining genetic diversity in wildlife. So in turn, that does suggest that kind of having more equally and equitably distributed green spaces within cities, and also making sure those green spaces are somewhat connected across an entire city, could potentially be very beneficial for supporting wildlife populations that are large, connected, genetically diverse, and therefore more evolutionary resilient to continued environmental changes occurring in cities. So just to wrap up here, I kind of want to just zoom out to the bigger picture of kind of what we're doing here and what we're thinking about here. So in other projects in the lab, we're also interested in kind of bigger picture questions than just thinking about effects of urbanization. One example is we're very interested in kind of why, this question of why species have finite geographic ranges. Okay, so, this is the distribution of the North American red squirrel. What's stopping it from just evolving to new habitats and spreading outside of that geographic range? Coming back again and thinking about our, populations across urbanization and how that's related to the amount of habitat and the distribution of habitat, it seems again that this very fundamental process of genetic drift and population size that's mediated by habitat availability also contributes to the evolution of species range limits. Zooming out a little bit again, our lab is also really interested in understanding how these population level mechanisms, so how these environmental changes that are affecting the demographics of wildlife populations, kind of what that really means at a big scale for how populations will continue to respond to global change. What we generally see across Canada and the US, at least for mammal populations, is that areas that have very high species richness correspond to areas with very low genetic diversity. And follow-up analyses on this suggested that both of these levels of biodiversity, so species biodiversity and genetic biodiversity, appear to be governed by common environmental causes that, again, come down to the availability and distribution of habitats. So if we come full circle to thinking about evolution again, the kind of relatively smaller scale effects that cities are having on individual wildlife populations, so fragmenting habitats, reducing available habitat, can have really large scale ramifications on species distributions and also have knock-on effects at higher levels of biodiversity. So in general, thinking about kind of what are those unpredictable effects of urbanization, specifically on wildlife evolution. Our results show that in general, it appears that urbanization by making populations smaller and more spatially fragmented is also making them more vulnerable to further environmental changes because they will tend to have a reduced capacity to adapt to those environmental changes because one, they're more strongly affected by genetic drift, and two, that makes natural selection less efficient in promoting adaptation. Our results also suggest that these ecological and evolutionary effects on wildlife populations to some extent reflect human inequalities, which was something I'm not sure we really expected to find when we first started looking into that. But that also suggests a kind of silver lining here because cities are, one of the habitats that humans have more control over compared to other types of habitats. So that suggests that if we make choices to make city habitats better for people, that will also improve them for wildlife and potentially make cities places where we can actually kind of actively engage in wildlife conservation. So with that, I want to thank all of my collaborators, all of our funders, and of course, everybody who posts their data online that we can harvest, and all of you for coming out tonight again. Thank you.
Any questions? You want to get to the hands? Great talk, I really enjoyed that. I was really interested by what you said right near the end about you showed those two maps of genetic diversity and species richness, and it seems really paradoxical. It seems like quite a because you would think that greater genetic diversity leads to speciation and so on. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, we do make something of it. It seems that, so I know these maps look very obvious, like they're negatively correlated, but in general, there's a little bit more nuance. We can see areas where, kind of both species and genetic diversity are hanging around in the middle. What we think is happening is kind of two major processes contribute to this. So first is just the general kind of availability of resources. If you have a lot of resources available, you can support a lot of different species, and you can also support bigger populations. So when there's just a high resource availability, we would expect both species and genetic diversity to be high. But then if you add in habitat heterogeneity, so if you have a lot of different kind of habitats that are kind of located close together, this down here is occurring because of the Rocky Mountains. So, you've got a lot of different elevations, you've got a lot of different kinds of habitats that are present there. That means that those resources are now kind of carved up into a lot of different niches. So it's a lot of different types of resources that can promote population differentiation and specialization. Maybe in the long run, that could also mean, more divergence and potentially speciation, but that part we're less clear on. So it seems that particularly in places that have a lot of resource availability, but also have a lot of heterogeneity, support a lot of species, but at the same time, a lot of small and potentially specialized populations. So that's why we see that negative effect happening there. Yeah.
Any other questions from the room? Got one, and I don't see any online right now. I just was really I feel like shocked, but also like understanding of the racial component to this and the history of that. And you mentioned, I believe it was 1964, the redlining is essentially banned out in a way. But are you aware of modern day, not necessarily formal redlining, but allowing a city to go downhill and then prices drop, buy it up, to problem people out in a way? My mind just went to, I believe it's Kensington is one of the cities in the States where it's just like intravenous drug use at the streets is normal to see for now until it's bought up, picked out, sold, and kind of done.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the specifics, but all of the resources I've read on this have suggested that it was essentially outlawed in its formal kind of federally mandated state. So, it used to be okay to do those kinds of things. If you actually go online and read the comments associated with those redlining maps, I guess it shouldn't be shocking because that's just how it was at the time. But to someone with today's sensibilities, it's very shocking that that was just the status quo at the time. So I do think that those similar practices have perpetuated, but they're under the table now. Yeah.
Anything for investors, for development, geared towards diversity over profit, especially with urbanization going up. It's something that you can include them.
That is a super, super tricky question. I feel like that's the just like big question in conservation and kind of fighting global change in general. How do we make this good for profit so that change actually happens? And I have to say, I don't know the answer. I think what I've proposed here is, very simplistic. Like that's just from the biology side of things. If we have more parks, if we have more green space, that would be good for wildlife, also good for people. But then if you think about the economic side of things, also increasing greenery in an area raises rents. So you end up in a kind of greenwashing situation where then you might still be kind of pushing out those vulnerable communities into locations that are still not necessarily as high habitat quality as in other places. So I think there's a lot of interacting factors that like I as a biologist am not fully aware of, but it's a complex question with a complex answer.
View from online here. The first is any comments on the current planning view on connected urban green spaces? It seems reminiscent of what farmers have done for many years.
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, what farmers have been doing, I'm not sure. So sorry, can't elaborate.
Let's put one more question from online. How do you account for the possibility of quite different predator-prey relationships in urban areas compared to that?
So we don't specifically look at, I think we don't get down into those kinds of details. What we would often see in cities is, kind of predator release. So because, at least for mammals, like predators will tend to be those kinds of larger species that are more excluded from cities. And so you see the kind of medium-sized mesopredators like raccoons and coyotes will tend to be the ones that proliferate in cities. But yeah, there's also prey species that are doing really good in cities. You have a lot of rats. Sometimes you have a lot of squirrels hanging around. So I think that kind of boils down to the kinds of traits that just allow certain species to be kind of pre-adapted to city environments. Those might be the ones that we see increased genetic diversity in cities. So I think to some extent we would capture that aspect just of, who is tending to do better in city habitats, but how exactly that affects predator-prey dynamics, the genetic data can't tell us too well, but we do know from urban ecology that, yeah, it tends to be those larger predators that are excluded, the smaller predators that proliferate, and a lot of prey species, where smaller species in general tend to do good in cities and their populations can expand quite rapidly.
Small rat to skyscraper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and pigeons are another cliff species that do well on skyscrapers. So yeah, yeah.
Like blizzards and stuff like that. It's a big shift where it's like deer are very known to be overpopulated and like that is very expected to like other species too. having them into areas like this where like they can't kill. Just like for those of healthy purposes and stuff. Fine, like do you know anything on your topic about like how other species in cities might be affected from that overpopulation being carried here?
The short answer is no. So yeah, I mean, just because in here, like with the genetic data, we can't really resolve kind of like ecological interactions between species. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't quite know because it really is smaller species in general that tend to do better in cities. So I don't know about a deer specifically if that would affect so much of, you know, like a mouse or a rat. But yeah, I don't know enough to. Yeah, I think that can get very complicated in cities as well because all of the species that, you know, eat human food waste, like there's for some species, there's a lot higher resource availability in cities. So it's again kind of like what resources are you using? Are you really depending on natural resources that might be available in a park, or are you eating the garbage that's available in the park? So it's, yeah, complex.
Kind of answered this one too, but it's a related question from online. Just why are deer doing so well? Yeah, that's a bit above the point of where you're focused.
It is, but you know, deer are generalist species. They're also highly mobile, and they can really get around in a city, and they reproduce quite quickly. So I think they've got a lot of the traits for like a really good urban adapter species in general.
They're actually fill up so much on highways that safe places in cities.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, you
So many deer. So many deer. Yeah.
Just kind of wondering, you know, how, sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to,
Yeah.
like bacteria and viruses develop some resistance. Is there any possibility, indication, suspicion of like animal species developing more protection against common foods in urban cities versus outside of urban cities?
Yes. If I remember off the top of my head, I can't remember what the trait is. This might be an unsatisfying answer, but clover are evolving, I think, what, cyanide resistance or something like this, kind of in response to urban habitats. I think they've also shown in this population of killifish that's in like a super polluted water body in New Jersey. They're also adapting to just cope with that somehow. You also see a lot of plant species that are evolving higher tolerance to like road salt, for example. So it is happening. I don't know the extent to which it's documented, but that's what a kind of a question that a lot of urban ecologists are actively interested in. Okay, yeah.
So is this increase? It's sort of like a two-part question. If so, like increasing the accuracy of seeing increase their success. And so how would you plan to sort of the success of those animals within cities, like maybe animals that are considered pests and stuff? Like, would you introduce coyotes, introducing coyotes to cities? That's, you know, small and
Yeah, no, that's a big part of this question. I would argue there that the kind of species we label as pests are the ones that are already here. And so potentially by, you know, I don't know if really changing habits can make that any better because like mice and things thrive in the house. They also thrive in parks. They kind of thrive everywhere. So I think the goal with this would be to help those species that are kind of intermittently coming in the city or just using resources in the city, or maybe help them better pass through cities. But that is also part of this complex problem, right? Like once you introduce more green spaces, I know like in my neighborhood growing up, there was like, that was just where the rats lived. But then it was eventually they kind of demolished it and built houses up instead, but then all the rats spread out into the surrounding, they went out into surrounding gardens. So I think it's the question of how humans will interact with wildlife is a really big open question that's already playing out, not necessarily in city environments, but like in places in Europe where they're reintroducing wolves and trying to rewild habitats to bring back wolves and bears and these kind of large predators that threaten livestock. It's a difficult question, and it's a question of figuring out how we can share the space. Yeah, I don't have the answer to that either. I'm sorry.
You got one online here. Did you look at invertebrates at all, specifically insects?
No, but I do currently have a student who's collecting some data on bees, and we have yet to see the results, but we're working on it. We are not through with all the vertebrates from across the globe yet, so the plan is to finish those first and then start moving on to everything else, plants too.
You were talking about how the mobility is an impact with respect to this. I couldn't help but think of, isn't that why pterodactyls continued on with the dinosaurs?
Potentially, but I have no idea.
They reinventing Chloe for the next movie.
You went to Rotary.
Yeah. Yes, I am. Bergen County, close to New York City. Okay. Yeah. My mom is from Trenton. From Trenton. Yeah. Yeah. I came back. Okay. My dad also worked for Bell for a time before it went down. My dad also worked for Bell before they he worked for the networks people's phones. People's phones like at Bell, and they were like the big somewhere in Bergen.
Wasn't very helpful.
So
Parsippany.
Parsippany, yeah, sounds familiar.
What was his last name? Yeah.
Schmidt.
I'll sing
I know, doesn't narrow down.
it.
Thank you.